Our last chapter ended with the founding of missions and presidios in San Diego and Monterrey. Portola had also explored along the Pacific coast and eventually discovered the Golden Gate. The title of this chapter is a bit foreboding. You can almost tell that something drastic is going to happen, and you know that the Spanish Empire has spread itself a bit too thin. In the meantime, California sat with its two small settlements 450 miles apart. They were isolated and travel between them was difficult. We also have to remember that the desert and the mountains that kept the California Indians isolated for so long were a factor here as well. The work of Junipero Serra was essential in the establishment of the missions and the movement of the Europeans into the territory. Eventually, there would be 21 missions along the coast, and 9 of these were built during Serra's lifetime. The next link in the chain of missions was San Francisco. A couple of other important figures came into play here. After the departure of José de Galvez, Antonio de Bucareli arrives as the new viceroy in New Spain. Bucareli is supportive of the missions and lends enough support to the holdings in California and makes them secure. At this time, Father Serra traveled to Mexico City seeking support for the missions. He also intended to ask for a new governor. Capitan Juan Bautista de Anza proposed the establishment of a land route from Sonora to Monterrey. This fit nicely into Serra's plan for expansion of the missions. Such a route would also facilitate travel between the existing missions and would connect them to the rest of New Spain. So Bucareli not only authorized the establishment of the land route to Monterrey, he also authorized the settlement of San Francisco. All of these events led to the establishment of a mission and presidio in San Francisco. The new mission was named San Francisco de Asís, and its location was marked by Anza on March 29th of 1776. Settlers began to arrive 3 months later. The establishment of the San Francisco mission now gave the Spanish 3 settlements on the coast of California. But it didn't end there. With José de Galvez now minister of the Indies, focus was now given to the reorganization of the frontiers in New Spain. There was now a new governor overseeing Baja and Alta California. He headquartered himself in Monterrey. Although he was under the supervision of the Commandant General in Arizpe, Sonora, he was able to continue the work of expanding the missions. It wasn't long before new settlements were established in San Jose and Los Angeles. In November of 1777, San Jose became the first town to be established in Alta California. Neve also founded the town of Los Angeles in 1781. These settlements were different from the missions. They were established as pueblos. Their purpose was to become agricultural centers that would provide food and supplies for the soldiers in the nearby presidios. It was difficult to find people willing to move out and settle in these areas. So most of the settlers or pobladores were basically poor folk interested in acquiring land. But even though they didn't begin as missions, most of the work was still done by Indians. In the meantime, we have a variety of indigenous tribes that are adapting in various ways to the presence and even the interference of the padres. By this time, hundreds of Indians had been recruited by the padres. They became the backbone of each mission, providing the labor that kept the presidios supplied. All the while, the missionaries were working at replacing their centuries-long practices and traditions with Roman Catholic beliefs and rituals. They worked, they prayed, they learned Spanish, and every aspect of their lives was controlled by the missionaries. The response to the interference of the missionaries varied. While most of the Indians were compliant, there were some groups that resisted, often violently, to the padres. Usually, the resistance was passive. The Indians often refused to work or worked at a slow pace in protest. Other times, they destroyed their equipment or simply fled the missions. Runaways were hunted down by the soldiers and brought back to the compound. The Indians also resisted participating in the padres' religious rites. They often showed less passive forms of resistance. Violence often broke out. Minor skirmishes were dealt with by the nearby soldiers, but often the violence resulted in deaths on both sides. The author of our text cites the massacre of 30 soldiers and 4 priests on one occasion, resulting in the closure of the Colorado River route that was a vital connection between the missions and New Spain. After the closure of the Colorado route, communication by land between Mexico and California ceased until the 1820s. For 40 years, communication by land was scarce. This, of course, led to California becoming less of a priority to the empire. Nonetheless, the missions continued to expand. The Indians, however, were never really trained to take over, and the padres never moved further north to start again. The population of colonists increased, but not because of immigration. The increase was due to births among the colonizers already present in the territory. All along, the private rancho and rancheros began to become an important entity. Eventually, Junipero Serra died and was succeeded by Francisco Palou for a brief period. In 1875, Fermín Francisco de Lasuen became head of the missions, continuing the work that Father Serra had begun. Lasuen was responsible for the construction of many of the beautiful structures that we see today when we visit missions. The simple buildings that Serra was able to put up were all eventually replaced, and the Indians learned new skills under his leadership. The number of missions doubled from 9 to 18, and the Indians that lived on the missions doubled to about 20,000. Although the Spanish Empire was in the throes of decay and California was given little attention, the missions flourished, as did the ranchos. The success of the missions would not have been possible without the labor provided by the Indians. Many have questioned what life might have been like for the Indians on the missions. Many of the stories we hear paint the Indians as docile and willing workers, eager to please the padres. Some accounts tell of misery and abuse. Visitors to the mission often had conflicting reports as well. Some criticized the padres for their treatment of the Indians, comparing it to slavery, while others saw the missionaries' work as a beneficent act that brought the Indians order and salvation. The truth of how the Indians were treated will probably never be known. Most of the information we have on the life of the Indians on the missions comes from the missionaries themselves, and most likely places less emphasis on the negative side of mission life. A few accounts we do have from the Indians themselves paint a much less positive picture of how they were treated. What we do know is that many died of the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. The Indians had no immunity to the new cooties. The impact of the European presence in California was devastating for the Indians. Their population plummeted as they fell victim to disease. Culturally, the impact of the Europeans was less severe. Despite the efforts to make them into Spanish subjects, the Indians retained their ethnic identities. The Spanish were not able to eradicate their traditions, beliefs, and practices. The Indians held on to their identities despite all they endured with the Spanish and the missions. Spain's issues continued, and eventually she had to give up her exclusive claim to the Pacific coast via a 1790 treaty with England. At that point, Spain's weak hold on the province was exposed as visitors landed and began to look around a bit. George Vancouver visited in 1792 and was not impressed with what he saw. The Spanish knew it too. They began to hustle about for some way to strengthen their hold and ward off any possible invasions or intrusion by other European powers. They struggled to set up a few more pueblos, but were unable to follow through, finding few people that were willing to go and settle in the province. The few that they did manage to convince were not choice citizens. The pueblo in the area near Santa Cruz struggled but managed to survive. After this, there were no more attempts to move citizens into California or establish any other settlements. The only exception were the ranchos that were established by those who were given land grants. These individuals would later become very influential and important residents of the province. Up until now, the Spanish had stuck close to the coast as they settled in California. The mission in Soledad was the furthest inland. This was necessary since the ocean was an important means of travel and communication with the rest of New Spain. In 1772, Pedro Fages ventured past the coastal range and discovered the Central Valley. Not much happened after the discovery. The valley was too far from the coast, a mountain range had to be crossed to get to it, and the inhabitants of California were too few and spread out to take any interest. Lieutenant Gabriel Moraga was responsible for the exploration of much of the Central Valley and the naming of many locations. El Río de Nuestra Señora de la Merced literally means the River of Our Lady of Mercy. We call it the Merced River. El Río de los Santos Reyes means the River of the Holy Kings. We call it the Kings River. San Joaquin is pretty much a no-brainer. Sacramento, sacrament, not too tough. Mariposa means butterfly. There must have been a few butterflies around then. Calaveras means place of skulls. No telling what he saw there. We all owe these names to Gabriel Moraga. So how did the Spanish finally lose their hold on California? It all started with the Russians. They established a fur trading post north of San Francisco in 1806. Count Nikolai Petrovich Rezanov came around San Francisco looking for supplies. He immediately saw the potential for business. The Spanish were a bit worried that the Russians would continue to colonize the Northwest. Unfortunately for Rezanov, trade with foreigners was illegal at the time. He had to take drastic measures. He basically had to marry into Spanish citizenship in order to trade. He sought the hand of Doña María de la Concepción Argüello, the daughter of a high-ranking military official. While arrangements were being made for the marriage, Rezanov was allowed to gather some supplies. Unfortunately, the marriage would never happen. But it was enough for foreign traders to get their foot in the door. The Russians eventually established a trading post in Fort Ross, just north of Bodega Bay, and Spain was suddenly no longer alone in the California coast. It gets worse for Spain. Napoleon basically invited the Spanish royals over for a party. Napoleon ended up imprisoning them and set up his brother Joseph as the puppet king in Spain. I guess they should have suspected something when they saw that the party was being held in the dungeon. All kinds of mayhem ensued, resulting in Spain having little time for the colonies in New Spain. So the Mexican Revolution begins. Miguel Hidalgo delivers his grito de Dolores in Dolores, Guanajuato. The revolution lasts for about 11 years, and news of Mexico's new freedom reaches California in 1822. A new chapter begins for California and the new Mexican Republic.